The party recovered from battle and prepared to head further east to the Cloud Spires. During the carriage ride, Mavis spent some time with May up front, during which he asked May why she deviated from her expected function and killed the Cyclops instead of healing Gar. May insisted that it simply felt like the right thing to do. Mavis made it clear that he needs to rely on her for her expected function, and May told Mavis to not worry about it as it should not happen again. The group continued east until eventually the road began to approach a forest. As the carriage drew closer to the forest, each of the group began to see figures of different people, each one seemingly important to each member of the party in some way, and each one gently motioning for the party to join them in the forest as the figures disappeared into the forest. Gar saw a female dragonborn, Laren saw a slightly older man, Zeos saw a man in some sort of robes, May saw 4 individuals, one of them twirling a baton through the air, and Mavis eventually saw a gnome with goggles on that surely must have resembled Zook. The group took some time to assess the situation, and they all agreed that it didn't make sense for them to be seeing who they each thought they were seeing, and that the forest could very well be luring them into a trap. But they also acknowledged the possibility that the forest was perhaps calling to them for something. Ultimately, the group agreed to investigate further, but cautiously. After tying up the horses, Gar called out to the figure he saw, and shared with the group that he was quite sure he was seeing his old crewmate, Nephair. However, to his knowledge, she was most likely dead. Mavis restated that he was quite sure this was a trap, but Laren added that it could be a clue, given everything that has been going on over their adventure so far. Looking into the picturesque forest, with the leaves gently falling to the ground, the canopies of the trees gently swaying in the wind, and the golden rays of sunlight piercing through the canopy, the forest was very inviting and almost seemed to encourage resting and enjoying the serenity. While traveling through the forest, the group continued to spot the figures they had been seeing, darting through the trees, continuing to motion them further in, seemingly guiding them through this landscape. Eventually, the group emerged from the woods into a small glade, filled with beautiful lush green grass and a single stump in the center of the glade, cut down to about 2 feet tall, before continuing further into the woods, still following these figures. Eventually, the entire group came to a stop when they all saw a female dragonborn standing just ahead, with her back turned to them. Gar approached and told the figure to turn and face him, and as the figure slowly turned her head to face the group, little bits of sunlight glimmered off of her sapphire eyes, and for a moment, Gar and Nephair stood reunited. Until Gar asked her to prove she was Nephair by stating the name of the ship that they both sailed on, and a terrifying smile grew across her face as she said in an eerie tone, "Well, it doesn't really matter now, does it?" As she backed into the forest, the group suddenly realized the true nature of their surroundings. The group had traveled far into the woods where every tree had died. The canopy overhead was replaced by a tightly bound tangling of branches that closed out any natural light, and the very darkness and shadows around them seemed to whisper and lurk with sinister intentions. The group quickly composed themselves and made haste to return to the carriage. After a short time, the scenery of the forest quickly returned to its picturesque, serene nature, and the group contemplated if Chasiana could somehow be in the forest. The group remarked that they were clearly led into a trap, but were surprised that they were able to escape so easily, and ultimately agreed to rest up before possibly investigating the forest further. The group agreed to rest in the town of Teu, which was within an hour's travel, before deciding for sure. As the party approached the town of Teu, they were approached by a farmer on the outskirts of town. The group asked if there were any urban legends or myths of the forest, and the farmer shared that the forest was known as the Lying Woods, a cursed forest that lures its victims in, and the ones that get away are cursed to lose themselves, in a process that begins with blanking, losing your train of thought inexplicably, eventually seeing hallucinations, hearing voices, until eventually you typically die in your sleep. The group asked for the name of anyone affected by the curse, and by a stroke of luck, the farmer mentioned the name of Chasiana Thaurazil, saying that the name stood out to him, and that she was a traveler that has been staying until she could figure out a cure. Finally, the farmer said that if the group wanted to learn more, that they should talk to the town magistrate, Alcaeus. Gar stated that he could probably help with the curse in some way, when he suddenly lost his train of thought, and the party realized that they now need to figure out how to cleanse this curse not only for the town and Chasiana, but for themselves as well. The group arrived at the local tavern known as the Crooked Nook. The party approached the bar and asked if the barkeeper had heard of Chasiana, when suddenly a half-elven female with short red hair, green eyes, and a bold, somewhat curious expression on her face approached the group, and the party now formally introduced themselves to Chasiana Thaurazil. May seemed to pretty quickly gain Chasiana's trust, and Chasiana eventually shared her experience so far, from seeing things that weren't there to hearing voices in the middle of the night. Once Chasiana learned that the group was serious about trying to rid this curse, she suggested that everyone meet with Alcaeus, as he would know more of the lore of the curse. After a sudden bout of spontaneous dancing on the dance floor from Gar, and Laren joining in to try and keep him company, eventually the two of them left to join the rest of the group. On their way to the temple, Mavis asked why Chasiana had sought out the Cloudspire monks, and Chasiana shared that she thought the monks might know something about cadence and cadenza, said to be instruments of Milil, instruments for change. In times of war, they would turn the tides of war, and in times of peace, they were his tools to enforce order and structure, and Chasiana thought that if she could find the instruments and play but a single note, perhaps she could learn what happened to the First Age. Chasiana also shared that cadenza was said to be strong, stalwart, unable to be moved, whereas cadence was flowing, changing, ever moving, and because of this, some people have thought that cadence and cadenza could perhaps be a violin and its bow, or a drum and its sticks. After their conversation, the party entered the local temple to Milil, where several people were housed in the temple that were suffering from the curse, and met with Alcaeus Bremley. Alcaeus took the group outside to talk, as he shared the story of the curse. Approximately 45 years ago, a warlock traveled through the town of Teu, setting up a home in the nearby woods, where he experimented with dark magics, trying to connect to the Shadowfell, and the dark forces of the Shadowfell responded, slowly spreading toward the town of Teu, until eventually the town took the matter into their own hands and stormed the woods and drove the warlock out, but the damage was already done. Alcaeus stated that there was no known cure for the curse, and the group contemplated if it was in fact possibly not a curse, but maybe an infection or a disease. Alcaeus seemed quite surprised that the group was so willing to venture into the forest to solve this, and he thanked them for offering their assistance, and offered some potions to take with them. During the conversation, the group asked if there was anybody else still living in Teu from around the time of the warlock, and Alcaeus told them of a potato farmer named Larry Mengar that they could speak to, and with that the party decided to call it an evening. May decided to spend a portion of the night helping out at the temple to ease the suffering of those afflicted by the curse. May prayed to Ilmater that if there was truly no cure for this curse, that she would take their suffering instead, even if it were to kill her. And as she slept for the night, she found herself in a waking dream of the grove the party previously visited. In this dream, the glade was even more peaceful than before, from the birds in the sky to the deer frolicking through the trees, and May sat on the stump in the center of the grove, as two birds landed at her feet, approaching the shadow of her head on the ground. May was able to see a second shadow mixed with hers that turned toward the birds, revealing teeth, and the birds fluttered away. Just before the dream ended, May heard a sinister laugh as she looked off deeper into the forest, feeling that this second shadow and the dark forest were linked. The next morning, May shared her dream with the group, and the group contemplated if they were perhaps under some form of possession, and discussed possible ways to deal with such a thing, though decided to not try any of them until they were outside of town. The party then visited Larry Mengar's house on the outskirts of town to discuss the story of the curse, and to see if it corroborated Alcaeus' story. Larry shared his account of being part of the raid that ran the warlock out 45 years ago, and described a broken stone building with some sort of strange fountain in it. The conversation with Larry was interesting, to say the least, though everything he said seemed to corroborate Alcaeus' story. After finishing their conversation, the group made their way to the edge of the forest just outside of Teu, and as the party now stares into the forest, each of them can still feel the forest calling them to it, seemingly never ceasing to attempt to lure in its next victim.